When the world was on the brink of an all-out nuclear war, the US Army built a secret city that could survive the end of the world. It was built 100 feet under the icy grounds of Greenland. But then something went terribly wrong. Something that the government tried to hide and almost got away with. But the thing about secrets is that they don't stay hidden. And you're about to discover the secrets of Camp Century, America's city under the ice. Alex Gardner was at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory when he got a disturbing message. It was from his colleagues who were up in the sky. They were flying over Greenland when their plane's radar picked up a strange signal. When they looked down, all they saw was snow. But the radar showed that there was something 100 feet beneath the island's snowy surface. Detecting man-made structures so far below the surface confused the crew and the scientists back at the Jet Propulsion Lab. "We didn't know what it was at first," said Gardner. "It could be an enemy base or an ancient city." There was no saying what the scientists had stumbled upon until they ran up the chain with the information they had. They were told that what they had uncovered was actually a top-secret US military base that was built in the Cold War era. NASA had discovered Camp Century. The location had been abandoned and was forgotten by almost everyone, especially the higher-ups. But the legend of the camp continued, mainly because of a book written by Henry Nielsen in which he covered how the camp came about. It started in the 1950s when US Army engineers started looking for the perfect spot to build an underground US military camp. By May of 1959, they had settled on a rough location in Greenland, and a small party was sent to survey the area. It didn't take long for them to settle on the exact location and start drilling. But wait, isn't Greenland part of another country? How can the US just march there and start building a military camp? The short answer is that they were already there. The US helped defend Greenland against the Nazis and in return got Denmark's permission to build military camps on the island. The agreement relating to the defense of Greenland signed back in 1941 was renewed and rebranded as the 1951 Greenland Defense Agreement, allowing the US to keep its bases on the island even after the Second World War. And this was really important because right after the Second World War, the US found itself in a Cold War with its former ally, the Soviet Union. And Greenland being roughly the same distance from Washington and Moscow became crucial for the US. Just being on the island wasn't enough. The US military had to be well equipped and prepared to face off against the Soviet forces. And that brings us to one of the strangest secret military programs in US history, Project Iceworm. The goal of Project Iceworm was to build a network of nukes under Greenland's ice sheet. Being able to launch these remotely would give the US all the advantage it needed in a nuclear face-off, but only if the Soviets didn't know about the nukes in Greenland. So, how do you build a nuclear base in another country without looking like you're building a nuclear base in another country? You act like you're building something else. And that's how we get Camp Century, a highly publicized cover project meant to distract from what was happening in Greenland. Here's a video from the US Army introducing Camp Century to the American public. This is the story of Camp Century, the city under ice. It was in May 1959, after more than a year of preparation, that a small party of Army engineers conducted the final search to select a site for Camp Century. This was the day we really got underway. We needed a flat surface, a level with less than 1 degree of slope. This would minimize construction problems by enabling us to keep all of our tunnels on the same level. Passages were cut through. Not all the excavation could be done by machine. The shovel was still a very useful tool. Next, work began on foundations for the prefabricated buildings that would be placed within the tunnels. Leveling the floor was very important to provide a good bearing for the foundations and prevent any building from settling unevenly. Of this was being shown to the American public. Not just the construction process, but what was inside the camp after it was constructed. Here there are showers for all and facilities for every modern convenience. It also has a small chapel for regular religious services. And it boasts the largest deep freeze in the world. Here is enough food to feed the camp for several months. The modern spacious kitchens provide a well-balanced and appetizing menu. To satisfy the enormous appetites that working in this climate produces means extra rations, but there's always more than enough. When was the last time the government was so forthcoming about what was happening on its military bases? If this was broadcast today, we'd all take it with a grain of salt. But this was back when Americans used to trust their government. So, they believed that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was genuinely working on building a city under the ice for scientific advancement. Plus, it was simply fascinating to watch what life was like under the ice. Except for the fact that they have no windows, the men of Camp Century live exactly as do other soldiers. Their quarters are modern, spacious, comfortable, and are not lacking in any detail. What that broadcast left out was the fact that the US had planned to install 600 Iceman missiles across 135,000 kilometers of Greenland's ice sheet. The tunnels were meant to move around the missiles between 2,100 launch points. The plan was pretty bold, but was ultimately shelved despite getting favorable reviews from the State Department and the Department of Defense. Iceworm wasn't happening. But Camp Century, which was built to distract from Project Iceworm, was allowed to continue. And at this point we see a remarkable shift in how the US talked about Camp Century, or how it stopped talking about the camp altogether. Initially, the public photos and video footage from the camp's construction were all over the media. But then things went silent, incredibly silent. And then one day, without explanation, Camp Century was abandoned. What happened? Why did the US give up territory, especially one under military use? We'd never do that unless we had a very good reason. And to find that reason, we need to know what was really going on at this secret military base. Of all the theories that people have come up with regarding Camp Century, the most fascinating one is the outer space theory. According to this theory, Camp Century was an experiment to see how well humans could survive in an isolated community and whether they could sustain themselves on a different planet. The idea was to create conditions that emulate the remoteness and the disconnect of being on a different planet, or perhaps the moon. Keep in mind that the camp was built when the US and the Soviet Union were in the middle of a space race. And given that it ended with the US putting men on the moon, it's pretty reasonable to consider that maybe a permanent settlement was in the cards. If we did intend to colonize the moon back then it would make sense why we chose Greenland as our practicing ground. For starters, any colony on the moon would need to be underground because the moon's surface is quite volatile. In the daytime, its temperature can go as high as 250 degrees Fahrenheit. And at night, it can go as low as -410. But if you dig just 2 m below the surface, the temperature gets more stable at around -40 degrees. So surviving on the moon would require being underground in a cold environment, just like Camp Century.